Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and in this episode I'm going to be talking about Peter Sloterdijk's critique of cynical reason. The title obviously being a reference to Immanuel Kant, important philosopher of the Enlightenment. In this book, Peter Sloterdijk is going to be kind of trying to reckon with the legacy of the Enlightenment, the meaning of the Enlightenment, instead of addressing himself to pure reason, a la Kant. He's addressing himself to what he calls cynical reason, which he views as the dominant form of reason, the dominant mood, the dominant attitude of the age. Putting a book like this, it's very big, it's very complex. Putting it into this format, a YouTube video, is difficult. So I hope that you are a little lenient with me and treat this as a kind of experiment. I'm cutting a lot and basically just going to address the things about the book that I think are particularly illuminating, particularly relevant to the present moment, particularly interesting. Not the whole work. So if you're interested, you should read the book. But anyway, this is an underappreciated work. He's an underappreciated philosopher in general, although in Germany he's something of a celebrity, I guess. I think he's probably the most original and important philosopher in the world today. And so we're going to look at his first book here. Later I'll be talking about his Spheres trilogy in other videos, and sort of the way I want to do that will be based on how this turns out, because that's more like 3,000 pages, whereas this is about 600, which already is, means I have to cut a whole bunch in order to put it in a YouTube video. The Spheres trilogy, when I tackle that, it's probably going to be a long series. But even then, I'm not really sure how I'm going to handle it, how much needs to be cut, etc. So this is an experiment for that. So yeah, just kind of bear with me a bit. But I think it'll be worth it. I think this video will be worth it. I think a lot of what happens here is paralleled or foreshadows stuff that happens in Spheres. And I think that, as a standalone, it's also very relevant too. I think that cynical reason still characteristically dominates the age. I think the relationship between it to theory, to critical theory, to the Enlightenment, etc. I think that's an important thing to understand. I'm going to try to stress it throughout this video. His oeuvre in general has a really unique quality where it's constantly totally different. Every book basically could be written by a different person, totally different conceptual vocabulary, totally different theoretical framework. He's always starting afresh, but nevertheless, and he tends to be really like poetic and evocative rather than like giving a kind of traditional philosophical argument. So that makes it a little more difficult to put in a video kind of format too. But there are general themes that kind of recur and a basic perspective or attitude that you can see throughout his works. And I think that we're going to see a little bit of it here in his discussion of Cynicism, as distinguished from Cynicism, Cynicism with a K, referring to the ancient Greeks, Diogenes in particular, and the traditional philosophical school, quote-unquote, of Cynicism with a K. And that's kind of what he sees as the counter-attitude, the necessary counter-attitude to cynicism that we should adopt today. We'll see that later. But I think that we can see this in Cynicism, the kind of attitude that is throughout his works. And so it connects up with Spheres. I think it'll serve as a kind of introduction to Spheres, although it's a totally different approach with a whole new vocabulary. Anyway, I basically agree with Heidegger in general about biography. Heidegger famously began a lecture on Aristotle by saying something like, he was born, he worked, he died, now let's turn to his text. But I do, and I agree with that in general. But I want to quickly say a little bit about Sloterdijk's biography, because in this case, it is sort of interesting and provides the probable motivation, I think, for this project. So he's a German, and he's born right after the war. He's born in 1947. So he's born into this atmosphere of like war guilt, of trying to grapple with the Nazi seduction and its effect on the German people, the relationship between Nazi ideology and the German cultural and intellectual inheritance. Then he's a teenager in the 60s. He starts college in 1968, which is the year of global protest, most famously May 68 in France. And again, all this utopian energy dies away. The hippies disperse. Everyone is disappointed. And then 4 years after finishing his PhD, he goes to Pune in India to live in an Osho ashram. He becomes a Rajneeshi and a disciple of Osho. And I don't know a lot about Osho, but it seems like he's trying to establish this sort of post-metaphysical, post-deconstructive religion, which does have a lot of parallels with Sloterdijk and his work, particularly Spheres. Osho is apparently like a brilliant guy, but I don't know a lot about him. But they seem like a kind of hippie cult too, famous for like the orgy as a sort of tool for achieving enlightenment. They basically get pushed out of India, and I think Sloterdijk doesn't join them, but they go to America and they try to establish a utopian community in rural Oregon. There's actually a recent Netflix documentary about it that's interesting called Wild Wild Country, if you've seen that. But the point is, this guy is a conservative thinker, Sloterdijk, but he's definitely also got these hippie credentials, and it comes through in this work, and it still comes through in his works today. I think it has a lot to do with this concept of cynicism, although in terms of this book, that portion of it as a kind of solution or counter project to cynicism, a counter attitude, I think is sort of unsatisfying. But yeah, he's a conservative philosopher, but he's trying to understand why all these social movements fail. He's trying to understand the atmosphere of disappointment, pessimism, what goes wrong, what goes awry in the ideas in these utopian projects, why liberation doesn't come, etc. Why all the hippies become ex-bankers, or why all the ex-hippies, are Wall Street bankers, and everyone's sort of given up. The utopian energy is sapped. So this question, I think, is what's taken up in this book. So now let's go ahead and turn to the text. So he says the whole book is a meditation on the phrase "knowledge is power," which I think comes from Francis Bacon, but maybe reminds us more of Foucault today and like his concept of power knowledge. Sloterdijk associates this idea with his theme, which is, of course, cynicism. The goal of the book, he says, is to lay bare the structure of this cynicism that he thinks today is the dominant attitude or mood of the West. And he's writing this in the early 80s, but it's obviously also true today. This analysis is, I think, deeply relevant today, maybe even more relevant. And by cynicism, he doesn't just mean skeptical about people and their intentions. He doesn't just mean pessimistic. It's deeper than that. He defines it as enlightened false consciousness, that it's a form of reason which is a priori reflexively rebuffed against falsification. It already always includes the critique of it. And so it both disempowers the critique and also undermines our confidence and joy and in living and in our beliefs and our conduct. In this way, he says that the cynical consciousness is both well-off and miserable. It's immune to attack, but it's, our views become immune to attack, basically. Our conduct is immune to attack, but empty, and we don't believe in them. And, we think that they're wrong, basically. We're all living in bad faith. Because of this, he says, new values have short lives. Grand narratives are impossible. We've given up on the idea of truth, capital T, and in a kind of enlightened way, consistent with the Enlightenment project, we just see all of this stuff as a strategy or a mask of power. We see and think everything cynically, including ourselves and our conduct and our beliefs. Everyone, including us, has base motives. Everyone's faking it to get ahead. So he thinks that this phenomenon of cynicism as reflectively buffered false consciousness, that in order to be understood, it has to be localized in a kind of dialectic of enlightenment, specifically as a polemical dialectic that is oriented to illuminating via unmasking and exposing our political opponents' motives, basically. About exposing their false consciousness, their prejudices, their desires, their hidden class interests, whatever, as a way of attacking their political or social position. So I say something, you say something else, How do we achieve synthesis here? Where do we go from there? And the way that it works is not, we come to X, Y, or whatever, but I have this bias, you have that bias, this is a class interest, etc., right? So he sees the process of enlightenment as a kind of progressive development of this sort of discourse, these techniques of unmasking. They become increasingly sophisticated and widespread, and then we wind up not with a win-win discourse, as proponents of the Enlightenment project would like to say, that aims at truth, capital T, but an interminable clashing of different identities, class interests, desires, passions, hegemonic positions, psychological resistances. We get a war of consciousnesses rather than a dialogue of peace. And this discursive war consists in the reification of the other's consciousness for analysis and inquiry. The other's consciousness is the target of the argument rather than the validity or the invalidity of their ideas. It involves endless reciprocal reification of subjects, leading to a condition where our interactions no longer are really intersubjective, but interobjective. And there's universal suspicion. With Freud, false consciousness looks like a kind of sickness. We trace it to unconscious drives. For Marx, we trace it to non-subjective economic historical laws and see individual people as just sort of epiphenomena in the process of capital. And all this stuff is operating behind people's backs and becomes the real subject of Enlightenment discourse. That's what Enlightenment discourse is illuminating. He actually thinks that Marxism is a kind of particularly important jump in cynicism, since we get not just false consciousness, but necessarily false consciousness. False consciousness that is false in precisely the correct way because stemming from your social class. The false consciousness appropriate to your social class. He thinks any functional understanding of truth actually inclines one to cynicism. Sociologists, even of the non-Marxist variety, tend to have a functional view where they think basically that false consciousness is necessary for society to function. But so then Sloterdijk goes through a kind of step-by-step historical development that he calls 8 unmaskings. And it's a kind of genealogy or tracking of the development of Enlightenment critique that proceeds from target to target. First, Enlightenment begins with a critique of revelation. These guys argue that there's no transhistorical, non-philological, objective way to verify the sacred texts. So that's, as you said, at the top of the macrosphere, at the sort of outermost limits of our metaphysics, the furthest away from man. That's where the Enlightenment critique starts, and then it goes down. So we move down a step and we get a critique of religious illusion. This critique notices how God is being anthropomorphized, how he's portrayed in a culturally relative way. This turns also into the idea of religion as instrumental or functional, existing to legitimate the social order or to ease our existential angst. Then we go down and critique of metaphysical illusion, and this is Kant basically, where human reason is limited and functions reliably only under conditions of experiential knowledge. So the power of pure reason is delimited. He says that after Kant, fruitful propositions concerning objects beyond the empirical are no longer possible, so that what first looked like knowledge, metaphysical knowledge, comes to be seen as deception. Then we get the critique of the idealistic superstructure, which he says is a giant leap for a critique. This is Marx, claiming that what happens in our head is determined by social functions and the economy of labor. He says that people are masks of social functions, and that religion, aesthetics, justice, welfare, morality, philosophy, science. Marx thinks all of this is ideological mystification. So, false consciousness, false being. This is a function of the process of capital in Marx. So we get necessarily false consciousness, which means universal mystification. Then comes the critique of moral illusion, and this has, he says, 3 strategies. Remember, as a polemics, right? The first is uncover a double standard. The second is invert being and illusion. And the third is a reduction to what are thought to be realistic motives. So basically, you catch your opponent in hypocrisy. You invert interior and exterior in order to attack the true core of their views or their belief. And this is always, power, egoism, selfishness, horniness, greed, whatever. Then we get the critique of transparency. And this is like Freud as the main figure, but he's not the only one or the first one. The idea of the rational, self-transparent mind has been systematically dismantled since the 18th century. Rationality starts to look like self-delusion, post hoc pseudo-justifications of our behaviors and ideas, an attempt to evade the deeper reality of the irrational forces and motivations that actually guide us. Freud was actually viewed as a reactionary for a long time because his idea of the unconscious undermines not just this or that class, but every class. Even the victim. Psychoanalysis is familiar with the idea of the eternal victim who exploits their apparent position of weakness for aggressions, right? So this undermines everybody. And then finally, just in case you thought, okay, well, maybe all this stuff is bullshit, but at least these irrational, unconscious forces and motives are mine. At least they're my desires. Wrong. The final one is we get the critique of the illusion of privacy. Your own ego doesn't even really belong to you. Even your selfishness isn't yours. You're basically just an object to be sliced and diced by Enlightenment critique until there's nothing left at all. Your self is molded. You're subjectivated, as Foucault would say, by all this discourse and these forces of social control and of power. You don't know what or who you are, and even if you did, it wouldn't matter because, to switch over and put it as Lacan does, even your desire is always the desire of the other. So Enlightenment begins with critique aimed at the top, at the church, officials, monarchy, whatever, exposing them as frauds. But the end result of this kind of dialectical polemics is that we even expose ourselves as frauds. That truth is a fraud. That even our fraud is fraudulent because it isn't even our fraud. It doesn't actually belong to us. There is no us to own it. And, so Nietzsche warned about Enlightenment's destruction of life-destroying illusions, and boy, did it. How do you believe anything or do anything or live your life or find joy or peace in a situation characterized by this mode of reason? Well, you do it cynically. You know very well what you're doing or saying is bullshit, but you do it anyway. This is actually, Zizek takes over this idea of cynicism from Sloterdijk. He refers to him frequently in his talks. He says, my friend Peter Sloterdijk. But this is how Zizek talks about how ideology functions today. They know very well what they're doing, but they're doing it anyway. That's how this works. And everybody else is doing and saying bullshit. And our institutions and our values are bullshit. And the idea of any escape or systemic transformation is bullshit. He actually anticipates our current identity politics fixation by saying that this creates a kind of manic drive to recover some sort of solidity. Something that's ours and stable. But, ultimately, we just get back to this, and it ensures even more the primacy of the alien over ourselves. We just find this sort of bedrock layer of unconscious programming, we hope. And all of this has just totally annihilated the possibility of ideological seriousness, of intellectual seriousness. Everyone's in bad faith. They know they're in bad faith, but there's no alternative. So strike up this defensive identity, live in bad faith. It's false consciousness, but we're enlightened about our false consciousness. We know that we're falsely conscious, and what else is there to do? So just, live in bad faith and do it to get by or win or whatever. What else is there? So then I'll go... Then he talks about how it functions in relation to different disciplines and stuff, but this is part of what I'm cutting. But I do want to point out the way he relates it to Weimar, because I think this gets at the deep relevance of this topic in the book to our present moment. He examines the psychopolitics of Weimar as being sort of pre-war, predisposed to Nazism, due precisely to the heavy atmosphere of cynicism. And he says, we can't live this way. So when the pressure builds up, violence erupts. People become catastrophilic. They're hoping, they're just waiting for something to happen, some catastrophe, some eruption of the real into the world so that there can be some meaning and substance again. You can't have a society where there's a universal distrust and suspicion, where nobody believes in politics, everything's too complex to grasp, the serious and the playful can't be distinguished from one another. There's a kind of so what you end up getting is there's a kind of desublimation. You're all consumed by will to power, and so just go ahead and let it out. Live honestly, at least, because otherwise there's just this deep ambivalence about everything, and it's precisely in this sort of social, psychological, psychopolitical stew that something like Nazism can develop. Its success has a lot to do with the need to simplify this tremendous complexity, this sort of schizoid tensions where all of us are living these double lives, pretending to be this or that, to be content, whatever, but deep down we suspect all of it's a lie and wrong and a malicious delusion, and it's unbearable, and so it demands some kind of event so that we can be disburdened of it. That's obviously not the path that he wants to go, Nazism. So what can we do? Well, he doesn't think that we can ever return to the simplicity of a mono-perspective, a world that we can know something definite about or master through the use of objective reason. We've lost the macrocosm, retreated back to subjective reason, but we get all the way to the bottom. It doesn't do any better because subjective and objective reason are both caught in a kind of mutual liquefaction, he says. Philosophy used to be about trying to find some kind of foundation that we can learn about, know about, that gives us information about the world and ourselves, because they link up with one another. Modernity splits these two things apart, and then the bridge that connects them is obliterated too, so that neither the world nor the self is intelligible even on their own. The self pole is exposed as empty, the world pole is a stranger. So as he says, how an emptiness is supposed to be able to recognize itself in a stranger cannot be imagined by our reason, no matter how hard we try. We can't do this. So from our perspective, knowledge about either pole, about both, or about their having a shared foundation at all anymore, just looks naive to us. Critical reason necessarily rejects both of these propositions. And yet, he says, only with the anticipation of universal understanding can enlightenment refrain from just the war of individual strategies and save itself in the universal. He goes on, the subjectivity that cannot mirror itself in any whole, nevertheless encounters itself in countless analogous subjectivities that, similarly wordless and encapsulated, pursue only their own goals, and that where they interact with each other, then they're bound together only precariously and subject to revocation in antagonistic cooperation. So again, this anticipates what I think is a much better framework for arriving at a solution that he articulates later in Spheres. The stuff about encapsulation, other stuff he says about auto-hypnosis, about the privileging of the kind of binding media of individuals over individuals themselves, at least. All this gets at a much more extensive treatment in Spheres, but for now, the main recommendation that he gives is what's called cynicism but with a K, and this is an allusion to the original Greek cynics, this tradition that he wants to return to, Diogenes in particular, and he thinks it's a much better way of fighting against cynicism today, and a sort of way of developing a serious movement that could actually challenge the status quo. And that's because basically it opposes idealism and this kind of cynical reason, not with further unmasking, not with more critique, not with a call to return to some kind of naivete that is unavailable to us now, but because it offers a material embodied rebuttal to the critical, cynical reason. Diogenes is famous for things like urinating and masturbating in public to demonstrate, rather than to argue, something about our norms, about the nature of desire and how easy it is to satisfy, etc. He's famous for plucking the feathers of a bird, taking it into the academy and saying, here's Aristotle's man. because the latter had defined man as a featherless bird. So Diogenes didn't argue with him. He didn't try to make a rational case for a different conception or to try to dismantle Aristotle's position via argumentation or whatever. He just has a kind of cheeky, lighthearted, jovial way of embodying the counter-critique as a jokester. And Sloterdijk thinks this is the way we ought to be today if we are to stand a chance at all against any of this stuff. And he really does himself also embody this kind of attitude in this book and today still, throughout his works. The idea that one becomes a kind of living, vital refutation of idealism, living with irreverence and joviality, rather than cynical suspicion and disappointment and disbelief and everything. This goes back, I think, to like the kind of Nietzschean idea of loving life, loving the body, opposing the despisers of life and the despisers of the body. But I think it also relates to, the hippie experience that Sloterdijk has, his experience with Osho. And I think it's the weaker part of the book, but I do think there's something to it, this kind of affirmation of life as a rejection of the despotism of negativity that, stifles all of us in this kind of heavy, cynical atmosphere. It's an escape from the confines of critique and its endless undermining of every possibility and every value. He says we ought to oppose critique, not with more critique, which is just turning the cynical screw even more, but with, this cynical attitude, just this sort of like Monty Python, I fart in your general direction sort of idea. So anyway, I skipped a lot. This is kind of a bare bones summary of the book in terms of the way that, in terms of the stuff that I think is important in it, basically. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope it was interesting and informative. I think Spheres is going to have to be a long series based on this. I skipped a lot of this book, and it's 600 pages as to the 3,000 or so of Spheres. And I don't want to skip a lot in Spheres, I think. But it might even be a pretty lengthy series. But I think they're super important books, this Spheres and de Benoit's View from the Right, which will also have to be a series. And there's not much about them on YouTube at all, or about this book. And, this video might kind of testify as to why, because this is a difficult topic, I think, to address here. But I'm learning. It's going to get better. This is a test. Thank you for sticking with me. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it and did get something out of it. Look forward to Spheres. And remember, don't simply react, but to think culture.